How old is the universe? The Torah tells us that Hashem created the world 5,777 years ago. Science tells us that the world began some 13 billion years ago. Who's right? Is the Torah right? Is science right? Or in fact, are they both measuring two different things? So let's carefully analyze what the Torah tells us, and let's see in fact if there is a contradiction. The Torah tells us that on the sixth day Hashem said, Naseh Adam, let us make man. And at that moment, a fully formed, mature Adam Rishon, first man, was born. But when he opened his eyes, he was an adult with a mature mind and a mature body. If I were to ask you then, how old was the first man, how old was Adam? You would tell me he was a newborn, one day or just born. Yet he occupied the body of a 30-year-old, wisdom teeth and all. Interesting. Stranger still, the Torah tells us that on the fourth day, Hashem created the grasses and the trees, fully formed in its completion right there. Now, we all know that a tree begins from a seedling. Put the seed in the ground and it sprouts. Year after year it grows, and typically you can tell the age of a tree. You see, when the bark forms, when it grows, it creates a certain ring in the wood. The next year, the next season, when the bark forms, it creates another ring. And if you cut down a tree, you could count the rings, and you could then tell the age of that tree, 100 years, 200 years, 500 years. On the fourth day of creation, when Hashem created the trees, tall, majestic, fully formed trees came out from the ground. If I were to ask you, how old are those trees? You would tell me, newborn, one day at most. Yet if you were to cut down one of those trees, you might count 500 rings on that tree, indicating that it was 500 years old. But even stranger still, the Torah tells us that in 6 days, Hashem created a fully formed world, mountains, oceans, rivers, the planets, the entire cosmos. Now, anyone who's studied earth science can tell you that mountains form over long periods of time. The tectonic plates begin exerting pressure, the lava sort of forms, and after thousands, if not millions of years, mountain ranges form. Yet, mountains were formed like that. At that moment in time, if I were to ask you, how old are the mountain ranges? You'd have told me newborn. Yet, if you were to study them from a geological perspective, it would have looked like millions of years old. But even stranger still, the Torah tells us that on the fourth day, Hashem created the Ma'oros HaGedolos, the sun, the moon, and all of the stars in the sky. That evening, if you were to look out into the night sky, you would have seen replete an entire world of stars out there, galaxies and constellations. Now that's a bit interesting, because if I were to ask you then, how old is the universe? Particularly, how old are the stars in the sky? You would have told me, well, they were created that day, one day old at most. Yet we all know that stars are very, very distant, very far out in the sky. Our closest neighboring star, Alpha Centauri, it takes light 4.5 years to travel from there to our own planet. But within our Milky Way galaxy, there are hundreds of billions of stars spread out across an expanse that's almost unimaginable. It takes thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years for their light to travel. But within the known universe, there are an additional 100 billion or so galaxies. And if you want to know how long it takes light from the furthest point to travel to our own planet, it's within 10 billion years or so, or maybe even longer. Yet the Torah tells us that on the fourth day, that night, when the moon came out, it was accompanied by an entire array of the stars with it. Meaning to say, the distant star light was visible on earth right then. So this brings us to an incredibly interesting point. What the Torah is telling us is that Hashem created a fully mature world. If you were to look at Adam at that moment, you would have seen a 30-year-old with wisdom teeth and all made that day. Trees 100 feet tall or more that were born that day, they might look to a unschooled person as 500 years old. Mountain ranges that take thousands of years, and starlight that normally would take millions of years or longer to travel. What the Torah is telling us is that Hashem created a fully formed world. If one wants to now measure that world based on criteria, how long would it take? It's irrelevant, because Hashem did not create a juvenile world and wait for it to grow up. Hashem created a fully mature world. The Torah is telling us 5,770 years ago, Hashem did this. When science measures the age of things, they're telling us in a chronological form, had it been processed differently, had it occurred differently, how long it might take. There is no contradiction if you understand what the Torah is telling us and you understand what science is measuring.